am Lori Tro, and I am president of the local Salina League of Women Voters. And I want to welcome you all to our February Lunch and Learn. We do these 6 times a year, and this is our second one for year 2022. So I'm excited that you're all here with us, and I am going to turn it over to Abner Perney, who is going to introduce our guest speaker for the day.
Thank you, Lori. We've chosen in our group that we thought we should have some discussion of the housing situation in Salina, since it has been in the news recently, mostly in the terms of shortage of housing for lower income and working families and households. Historically, the housing authorities were established with funding from the federal government starting way back in 1935. I worked for HUD from 1969 to 1980 with housing authorities in distributing funds for housing programs, and in 1983 to 1994, through a series of weird turns of events, I became executive director of the Salina Housing Authority. Salina Housing Authority was unusual in that after the 1965 closing of our air base, there was a housing surplus, and the Housing Authority addressed some of that problem of excessive housing by acquiring existing homes, rehabbing them, and then making available to families of low income at affordable rates. In my term, I expanded the size of the program by roughly, I think, 110 units of the old 1935 pure public housing, plus the new Section 8 rental assistance housing, which relies on private landlords providing low-income housing with the help of vouchers from the Housing Authority. So now we've gone full circle. The Housing Authority is in a transition again, has really been since 1980, toward more privatized forms of housing. And Mr. Phil Nix, a Southern gentleman, he's got 31 years experience with housing authorities and HUD in general. He's been executive director of our housing authority for just about 18, 20 months, something like that, and is working to further the transition into more publicly owned or more privately owned housing that still receives some kind of housing assistance. Programs are completely different than they were when I retired 28 years ago, except for the existence of Section 8 vouchers. And so he needs to do some explaining. Phil, next, please.
Oh, good afternoon, everyone. It's nice to meet you guys virtually anyway. Hopefully one of these days, I was telling Abner on the phone the other day, we're living in a different world where we're having to do things virtually, where I've been in Salina now going on 2 years, and there's still a lot of folks that I haven't met. I've talked to several times, but just not in person. But Abner is correct. There's been a change taking place in housing, and it's because there is such a backlog of distressed housing in our country. In 2017, there was a study done of all housing authorities in the United States, and there was discovered that we had about a $35 billion deficit in money to restore housing as it was, and a lot of it was original. Now, bringing that farther down to Salina in our small world compared to the country is a public housing program. They give you what is called capital funds every year, and that is HUD's way, or HUD's idea of how a housing authority is to renovate or keep their units up to date. Now, Salina's public housing units, we currently have 162. Back 25 years ago, HUD was a little more friendlier with letting a lot of money go. They've tightened the reins on that, and it's come to fruition for housing authorities to try to figure out how are we going to continually update and renovate our units to provide a decent, safe, and sanitary house for our residents. And so in 2012, HUD realized that HUD cannot carry that bill alone. We average $300,000 a year in capital fund grants, and all of our 162 units are in need of serious renovation. And by that, I mean probably $25,000 to $35,000 per unit. Not all of them need quite that extent because we have been chipping away at the iceberg, so to speak, annually on $300,000. $300,000 doesn't go very far anymore in the renovation world. And so we can generally, off that annual grant, we can generally rehab 7 to 8 units per year. Now, if we were to try to do all 162 units, it would take the Housing Authority 13.7 years to renovate all of their units. And then by the time we got to the end of that spectrum, we would have to start all over again with the first ones that we ever rehabbed. So in 2012, HUD realized we've got to do something different. And so they come up with what's called the repositioning strategy. And that's whereby under the public housing guidelines, a housing authority is not allowed to borrow money to rehab their units. And so the public housing program has to do that solely based off that capital fund grant. You can use some operating subsidy. The way a public housing program is financed is through HUD's operating subsidy, the capital fund grant, and then rental revenue. And in time you pay administrative costs and take care of running the housing authority, there's just not near enough that we need to be redeveloping or renovating our units. And so the board and the housing authority was faced, how do we provide long-term available rental units? And HUD come up with a repositioning strategy. And a lot of housing authorities, matter of fact, there's been over 100,000 housing units across the country that have participated in what's called the Resident Assistance Demonstration Program, or RAD, as HUD calls it, and that came about in 2012. And simply what this does is allow a housing authority the chance to close out their public housing program and convert everything to a Section 8 voucher through what's called project-based vouchers or project-based rental assistance. And so the board in 2018 decided, and the executive director at that time, that they were going to reposition the housing authority to be able to maintain its housing stock for the long term. And so we started that process, the planning process, in 2018. And right now we have brought that down to a 3-phase project. We are going to rehab 119 units. We are going to sell 44 of those units to the local CHODO, and they are going to purchase those and maintain either low-income rental housing through them, or they are going to convert them to the home ownership program for the residents. And so by us doing that, and the other reason that HUD would allow us to do that, because Salina is unique. Now, I was telling Mr. Abner, I've been all over the country managing housing authorities, and Salina is one of the most unique housing authorities that I've ever managed. Usually a housing authority has either a low-rise facility or a high-rise facility with several units in it. In most of the towns I'm in, Salinas are scattered all over the city of Salina. In buying those military houses of the military back years ago, they were just scattered all over town. And so that becomes a maintenance nightmare for one, and the cost is unbelievable because we're having to drive all over town. So part of our repositioning strategy was trying to localize or centralize our housing stock into the central part of town. So some of the units far south or some of the units far north or east and west, we are disposing of and getting rid of, trying to centralize our units to make it easier, a financial burden and a maintenance burden. And so our three-phase project, we are going to do that through Kansas Housing Resource Corporation, which is they will provide tax credits to the housing property. Now, we have already submitted a tax credit application to the state that has been approved, and that is for the first phase of the project, which is to renovate those 119 units. I don't know if you're familiar with the low-income housing tax credit program, but that's whereby investors, the state issues or allocates the housing authority a certain amount of tax credits. Investors purchase those tax credits, and then they, for 10-year period, they get to count their investment off on their taxes as a tax deduction. And that's how we raise the capital to do the rehab grant or the new construction grant. So phase one is going to rehab the 119. We are going to do that by tax credits. The second phase is we have purchased, I'll take that back. We are in the process of purchasing some property over by the National Guard Armory. It's actually the Army Reserve here in town, a vacant lot that used to be a trailer park. We have a meeting with the city in March to rezone that to multifamily housing. And our plan is there to build a 2-story complex, apartment complex, 1 to 3 bedroom apartments, and there's going to be 48 units there. The third phase of that project, as I've already mentioned, is that we're going to sell 44 of our public housing units to the Chodo. They've been looking for a project, wanting to do something, and so we have kind of partnered with a local Chodo, and they are going to purchase that project, and we are going to use the proceeds from the sale of those houses to go towards our new construction project, hopefully to raise $3 million for the project. And so it's, as you might guess, dealing with HUD, we have been in a paper process for a year and a half, and that's going to continue for the next year. Hopefully, we have to submit an application to HUD for approval to dispose of public housing units. We are in the process of submitting that HUD application. We have already submitted it once. HUD has returned that application to us. Didn't like the way some things were worded, and so we're regenerating that second application. That will be submitted after we have to hold a public hearing to change our annual plan. That's going to be held at the end of this month. Once that's done, then we will be able to submit that second application. Phase one is already in the process, and phase two will start hopefully by May. Now, at the same time, we hope to go through the closing process with HUD to close out our public housing program altogether. Now, in doing this whole process, we have to guarantee our residents that no one will be dislocated or will lose their public assistance during the process. And so we have a relocation plan in process to whereby we will relocate the residents either temporarily or permanent based off the residents' choosing. Once we have been maintaining some vacant units in our public housing program so we can assist in that transition until we can rehab those units and either move those residents back or allow them to stay. And then we plan on closing out our new construction project and be able to begin construction in August of this year, probably looking at construction 2023, maybe renting those units in 2024. The total price tag we're looking at for all three phases, we're looking at about a $33 million project. We have looked at some other properties in town, and the board is considering other avenues, but we're trying to get these three phases off the ground and get them started and completing. And then we are going to consider some other projects. We have been able, we had some other properties in town here recently. We've been able to sell those to raise more money for our project. And so then we're going to issue everyone, just like our Section 8 program, they will get a voucher of some form or other. And then we have 384 vouchers. Our total housing stock is 546. We're looking at adding an additional 200 units over the course of all the project. So we're going to be in a neighborhood of somewhere around 650. That's what we're doing and what we're considering. The planning has been ongoing. It's already changed. It started in 2018. We've changed it a half a dozen times in the course of that period. But now we're getting to where we're starting to lock down applications. And so that's the $33 million project is where we're at this time. That's what we're at and what we're doing. And unless you have questions, that will complete my process. Go ahead, Ms. Lori.
I have several questions. What is this Chodo that you were talking about?
It is a local housing complex. It's a community housing development organization. And they operate off HUD funding as well. It's off home funds through the state. And they apply for different housing grants. And so they wanted to buy a property from us to start with until they found out a project, and they're interested in buying and continuing the low income. And that was one of the aspects of HUD application, is that we try to maintain the low income housing, and going through the local Chodo allows us to do that.
Could you tell us who's the head of the Chodo? It's a guy that seems like he's familiar to a lot of us. Do you remember his name?
His name is Gary. Rodney, can you help me? I'm not
Gary
good
Hobby.
with last names yet.
It
sorry.
is Gary Hobby.
Yeah,
Hobby.
Gary Hobby, yes.
He spoke at the city commission meeting yesterday. Okay.
Right.
Because I'd heard the Chodo and I was like, where'd I hear that? And I was watching the city commission meeting. The other question is, do you have a huge waiting list for people that are wanting to go
Yes, we do.
through and what is the process of how do people get on the list, or what's the criteria?
They come in, they submit an application. They have to fall in a certain income threshold. They have to have a certain size household to fit into a HUD unit. HUD will not let you overhouse a family in like a small 1 or 2 bedroom. You have to have certain amount of people. You have to have criminal background check, credit, that kind of thing. Once they come in, they get on the waiting list, and then they stay on the waiting list until they get in the top 5, and then we verify the information that they submit on their application, and at that time we send them out. Right now we currently have 20 housing choice vouchers out, looking for houses to rent. Now Abner mentioned, there it is a struggle right now finding rental houses in the city of Salina. We've had some vouchers out looking for a while. Finding affordable units is a problem. Of course, the private market rental rates are always fairly extreme. A little bit hard for folks who are on assisted income to meet that threshold. But our waiting list currently is at 192 for the Section 8 program. Our public housing waiting list is at 150.
Tax credits are actually federal tax credits, are they not?
They
And so
are, and
they don't take away income from the great state of Kansas.
right, they are given to the state of Kansas from the federal government, and
To
then the
manage them, but
state
they,
of Kansas allocates them out to not just housing authorities, other housing entities as well.
right, but they come, but you use them if you're an investor in those. And I was once an investor in a small tax credit project in the metropolis of Wilson, Kansas. But you use those tax credits against your federal income tax. So
Yes.
it goes to people that, and I don't know, have you got any announcement? Will these be sold in relatively small quantities to people in the city of Salina, or is it going to be a big bucks deal?
It's a big bucks deal. In our first phase, whereby we've already had the tax credit application approved, we have already solicited for and contracted an investor, and that is Redstone. And we allow them to bid. And right now, they were the higher bidder for the tax credits. And they were at 86 cents on the dollar. And the second one who bid it was at 82 cents on the dollar. So we went with the highest bid, which is 86 cents on the dollar.
Okay. So totally different from the one that I was in, because it's a 6-unit housing project in Wilson, Kansas, and it was all directly solicited by the man that put it together. And you could get into it for $15,000.
Yes. Our first phase, we're at a cost of around $16 million. Our new construction phase is at a cost of $11 million. So you have to have some pretty deep pockets.
Right.
To meet
And again, the site for the new construction is that mobile home park that's actually on Cloud Street.
That is correct.
And Broadway, to the
that's
west of Cloud and Broadway. Okay, it's been stripped down just to the bare ground for 5 or 6 or 10 years. I don't know. It seems like a long time now. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm curious, Mr. Nix, where you've been before and how our issues here compared to those places.
Well, as Salina is unique, my career has been unique. I started out in maintenance in the state of Alabama a long time ago. And from that, I became an executive director, and I fell into, didn't do it on purpose. It just came my way. The HUD office called me one day and said they had a troubled housing authority. Would I go and manage it and get it back up? And so that was the first one. And since that time, I've been in 12 different states at 15 different housing authorities, managing housing authorities that have some issue or another. Not all of them have been troubled with HUD. Some of them have just had audit findings that needed some clearing up. And I actually came to Kansas for the first time in 2003, and I was here for a couple of years. And at that time, both my sons were a junior and senior in high school. I was here long enough for them to start their first year in college. So they met a couple girls from Kansas, got married, and my wife said, "You've bounced all over the country. Now you're getting me close to my kids." And so that's why I'm back in Kansas this time. But I've been all over the Southeast, even on the East Coast some. And the first time that I was in Kansas the first weekend. They told me we get some snows, but not too bad. The first weekend I was here, it snowed 15 inches. And I said, okay, if this is a normal snow, I'm in trouble. I'm not going to like this. And so yeah, but I've been all over the country managing housing. Sometime as little as 3 months, depending on what the housing authority needed. Sometime just some consulting work to help them get straightened out some things that they had not done correctly. Sometimes I was in Arkansas for 7 years, and that Arkansas is actually the first place that we're in trouble, and we actually got them back to a high performer status and actually did a development project with them. That's been the longest time I've been anywhere, has been 7 years in the housing authority. I've always just moved around and did what the housing authority. Salina Housing Authority had no issues. They were a high performer. The previous director did a good job. All of their previous directors have done a good job. But she moved on actually got a job in the local HUD office and moved out of state. And so I'm basically was hired by the board just to complete what she started back in 2018.
Are you in any way in touch with the Chamber of Commerce and the city and the Economic Development Corporation in any kind of coordination with the other housing efforts in town right now?
We have not. Eric is on our board. He is with the Chamber of Commerce. He keeps me involved in what's going on in town. And we have not partnered with any housing edgy other than the Chodo. We do keep involved in what's going on. Contact and other developers have contacted us to talk about what's going on. We get phone calls all the time wanting to know about housing, but since we are in such a, I don't want to say taking the housing authority in depth, that's actually what we're doing. There's only so much that we can do at this time as far as be involved in a lot. So we hopefully, as we are able to get some of our processes done, we'll be able to partner with some of the other entities and plans that they have. But outside of just issuing vouchers to those who are developing property right now is about the end of the scope of the housing authority's connection with any other housing that's going on.
I'm curious where your boys are, where your sons are.
My oldest son is in Wichita, and my youngest son is in Pratt.
So true small, well, sort big city Kansas and small town Kansas. It's an interesting combination. And Salina's kind of half and half. Salina's never been able to make up its mind whether it's our Kansas's largest small town or smallest big city. And we have all the rules of a big city, so I tend to go with the smallest big city theory for whatever that's worth. It's interesting then that you're making all these changes. The Chodo was actually formed. I was part of that way back about 1990, but was never funded and never really had a committee that had a vision until Gary Hobby retired from the city as city planner, and then he got interested in and has cranked it up. So he's another person we might want to bring in to talk about the current housing situation at some time in the next couple of years, because we're probably going to continue to be in a bit of a housing bind with the success we've had with industrial development around here, and the fact that the cost of housing is just incredibly high lately and still going up as near as I can tell. And it's a trickle-down industry. It's always been a trickle-down industry. Only people with money can build new housing. That's and it doesn't get down to the lower income working people, usually until it's old or it's subsidized in some way. And So it's a very delicate balance in a lot of respects to keep housing going and to get new housing that's affordable. So I appreciate your efforts in trying to work with the ever evolving system to keep it at least possible so that there's some trickle down.
Yes, it's challenging for an executive director of a housing authority. You've done housing for so long a certain way, and now to be able to keep the power on and do some other housing, you're having to begin to think outside the box and go through some other issues, find some other funding streams to where you can actually just maintain the housing you got, much less construct any new housing. So it's challenging, to say the least.
There are some affordable housing, like towers over on Oakdale and on Johnstown, and those are not Salina Housing Authority, or are they? No, go ahead.
No, those towers are not ours, and we get asked that all the time. But they're not. Now, we did own some properties over on Oakdale and Johnstown. We just owned 10 units over there, but the towers were not part of that, and so we have nothing to do with the management of the towers or anything like that.
Yeah, I was actually the HUD housing, multifamily housing development representative on Oakdale Plaza and Johnstown Towers way back in 1974. Those projects were HUD 236 projects, which is a direct federal loan of 3%, plus they received Section 8 rental assistance to the project itself for at least part of the units. But they were relatively low rental when built new because of the low interest rate at that time. Now 3% is normal, but in those days normal was 6 to 7%,
Right.
and going up dramatically, went clear up into the teens. And then they also had the Section 8 rental assistance for part of the units, and then later it's been, I believe it's currently got 100% project vouchers for keeping the rent low. But they're privately owned. They've been privately owned since brand new. And that was in the days, middle 60s, well, late 60s. I started with HUD in 1969 through about 1980, but especially that first 5 or 6 years with HUD, there were years where HUD was putting out 1.5 million subsidized housing units a year. George Romney was Secretary of Housing and Urban Development under Richard Nixon, and they were following through, oddly enough, on the Great Society type legislation laid out by the Johnson administration. George Romney, I got to meet in person twice in relatively small meetings. That's Mitt Romney's father. He was former CEO and president of American Motors. He was big on mass production, and he brought forth a program called Operation Breakthrough, which was to develop modular housing that could be built year-round in factories and installed, and thereby affect some savings in the high cost of constructing housing. And had some pretty good success with it, but with a lot of federal money behind it. And then since the 80s, the federal government emphasis has been to get out of publicly owned housing and really even on directly publicly financed. They substitute the tax credits, which you just heard, you get 86 cents on the dollar that you don't get. So in some respects, it's not as good as a subsidy program would be, or you could pay dollar for dollar and say, we cut your cost of your building for so many dollars, and you have to thereby cut the rents in proportion to that for the life of the project. But that's not the program we have. So
Yeah.
But we had programs like that in the 60s and 70s. But history's long gone, and it keeps changing. We thank Phil for taking the time to let us know what's going on with his agency. and give us a couple ideas about other people we might want to talk to if we want to know a little bit more about the housing situation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.
We'll sign off.
You have a good day.
Okay.
Thank you. And next month will be March the 8th for our March Lunch and Learn. Be on the lookout for emails about what our topic's going to be. We've got a couple thoughts and we'll see what pans out.